The tension in the room was palpable. The murmurs of congressional members faded into silence as Karoline Leavitt strode toward the podium, her expression unwavering, her presence commanding. This wasn't just another routine speech. This wasn't another carefully crafted political monologue meant to appease the status quo. No, this was a moment of reckoning. She took a measured breath, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Across the chamber, Adam Schiff sat with his usual composed demeanor, but there was something different this time. Perhaps it was the way he shifted slightly in his seat, the way his fingers drummed lightly on the desk, as if bracing for what was to come. He had been challenged before, of course, criticized, called out, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't facing a predictable opponent from the establishment. This time, it was Karoline Leavitt, and she came prepared. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate, cutting through the air with precision. The American people have watched for years as deception has been passed off as truth, as power has been abused under the guise of justice. Today, that ends. A hush fell over the chamber. Eyes locked onto her, waiting to see where she would take this. Some lawmakers leaned forward, others folded their arms, their expressions unreadable. But one thing was clear. Everyone was listening. She glanced around the room, making sure to meet the gaze of those who had blindly supported Schiff in his years of unchecked authority. We've sat through speech after speech, hearing justifications for misconduct, excuses for lies, and attempts to rewrite history. We've been told to simply move on, to forget, to accept that what was done in the past no longer matters. She paused for effect, then continued, her voice sharpening. But the past does matter. The truth matters. And today we confront it head-on. From the back of the room, a low murmur of unease began to build. It wasn't just the usual political theatre. There was an undeniable shift happening. This wasn't the carefully managed, polished rhetoric that Washington was used to. This was raw, unfiltered, and for some, deeply uncomfortable. Leavitt's gaze finally settled on Schiff. Congressman Schiff, you have stood in this chamber countless times and spoken with the certainty of a man who believes he will never be held accountable. You assured the American people that you had undeniable proof that justified the investigations, the division, the relentless pursuit of power at the expense of truth. But where is it? A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps even concern, flashed across Schiff's face. He adjusted his tie, glancing at the colleagues beside him, but no one intervened. They were letting this unfold. They had to. Leavitt didn't relent. The trust placed in public officials is not a weapon to be wielded against the very people we serve. Yet time and time again, we have seen deception dressed as patriotism, abuse of power masked as justice, and manipulation of facts presented as integrity. And you, Congressman, have been at the very center of it all. A few audible gasps rippled through the chamber, but she pressed on. This is not about party lines. This is not about ideology. This is about accountability. You spent years telling the American people that you had proof of collusion, proof that justified tearing this country apart, proof that never existed. And when the truth came to light, when the fabrications were exposed, you moved on as if the damage left in your wake was inconsequential. Schiff shifted again, his lips pressing into a thin line, but he didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Leavitt let the silence sit before delivering the final blow of her opening remarks. This is not about politics. This is about restoring faith in the very institution we stand in today. If we allow deception to go unchecked, if we turn a blind eye to corruption simply because it is inconvenient to confront, then we are no longer representatives of the people. We are merely enablers of a broken system. The weight of her words hung in the air. Some members nodded subtly, while others remained stone-faced, unwilling to acknowledge the undeniable truth in her statements. The stage had been set. This was not just another speech. This was the beginning of a reckoning. The room was frozen in silence, the weight of Karoline Leavitt's words still lingering in the air like an unshakable truth. But she was just getting started. She had laid the foundation, and now it was time to dismantle the carefully constructed web of deception thread by thread. She took a step forward, her eyes scanning the chamber, making sure her next words would not be ignored. For years, the American people were fed a narrative. A narrative carefully curated, endlessly repeated, and defended by those who claimed to be the guardians of truth. We were told there was irrefutable proof, documents, testimonies, classified briefings, all pointing to a grand conspiracy. But when it was time to deliver that proof, it was nowhere to be found. A few lawmakers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Schiff remained still, his face an unreadable mask, but his fingers tapped ever so slightly against the desk in front of him. The subtle movement did not go unnoticed. Leavitt pressed forward. "Congressman Schiff, you did not hesitate to stand before cameras, to look the American people in the eye, and declare that you had seen the evidence yourself. You said it was beyond circumstantial. You assured this very institution that justice demanded immediate action. You spent years pushing a hoax that divided this nation, that fueled chaos, that undermined trust in our democratic process." She let her words sink in before delivering the next blow. And when the truth was finally exposed, when investigation after investigation proved that there was no collusion, that there was no grand criminal conspiracy, you didn't offer an apology. You didn't express regret for misleading millions of Americans. No, instead you moved the goalposts. You deflected. You insisted that, despite all evidence to the contrary, you were still right in your pursuit. A hush fell over the room. It was one thing to hear these accusations on television, in opinion pieces, or in partisan debates. It was another thing entirely to hear them delivered, face to face, in the halls of Congress, with no escape. Leavitt's voice remained steady, but there was a sharpness to it now. "You claim to be a defender of democracy, but what you did was not an act of defense. It was an act of betrayal. You weaponized your position not to serve the American people, but to serve your own agenda. You convinced millions of citizens that their elected president was an agent of a foreign power. You stoked paranoia. You pitted neighbor against neighbor. You eroded trust in the very institutions you claim to uphold." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some lawmakers exchanged glances, while others sat rigidly, unwilling to acknowledge what was unfolding before them. Schiff's allies, usually quick to defend him, remained silent. Leavitt took another step forward, and it wasn't just the American people who suffered from your lies. It was this institution. It was the credibility of Congress. It was the faith people had in fair and impartial justice. You dragged this country through years of baseless investigations, wasted taxpayer dollars, and sowed deep divisions, all for political gain. She paused, scanning the room once more. "So tell me, Congressman Schiff, where is your proof? Where are the documents you claimed existed? Where is the undeniable evidence you swore to the American people was real? Because after years of scrutiny, after every report, every testimony, every failed attempt to validate your claims, all that remains is the undeniable truth. You lied." A sharp intake of breath could be heard from somewhere in the chamber. Schiff's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. He couldn't. The room had turned against him, not with noise, but with silence. The kind of silence that signified recognition, the kind of silence that weighed heavier than any words ever could. Leavitt let the moment stretch before speaking again, her voice unwavering. "And now, the American people are left to clean up the mess you made." The weight of Karoline Leavitt's accusations hung thick in the air, an unshakable force pressing down on every corner of the chamber. The silence was not one of indifference, but of unease, of realization. Some members of Congress shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others stared ahead, their faces expressionless, unwilling to acknowledge the truth that had just been laid bare. Schiff, for all his years of experience, for all his carefully crafted defenses, sat motionless, his fingers now still against the desk. He knew what was coming next. Leavitt's tone didn't waver, her confidence didn't falter. She had built her case with facts, with direct quotes, with undeniable history, and now she would expose the hypocrisy. "Time and time again, you have lectured this chamber, the media, and the American people about the importance of transparency," she said, tilting her head slightly as if addressing him directly. "You have stood where I stand and spoken of justice, of accountability, of the moral obligation to defend democracy." She let out a sharp breath, a bitter chuckle escaping her lips. "And yet, when it was your turn to be transparent, you fought to keep the truth buried. When it was your turn to be accountable, you dismissed every challenge, every question, every call for honesty. You manipulated intelligence behind closed doors, selectively leaked information to push a narrative, and concealed exculpatory evidence that contradicted the very claims you stood on. A stir in the room. Some members of Schiff's own party exchanged uneasy glances, while others stared at their notes, avoiding eye contact altogether. The hypocrisy was undeniable. He had built his reputation on demanding truth from others, while shielding himself from the same standard. Leavitt continued, her voice unwavering. You told the American people that it was dangerous for anyone to question the institutions of our democracy. But what could be more dangerous than a man in power abusing his position to spread lies? What could be more dangerous than an elected official who fabricates scandals to silence his political enemies? And what could be more dangerous than someone who claims to defend democracy while actively dismantling public trust in it? Schiff remained quiet, his usual arrogance replaced with something more subdued, more uncertain. The cameras were on him, capturing every movement, every expression, or lack thereof. He had faced criticism before, but never like this, never so directly. Leavitt pressed forward. You claimed to be standing for justice, but where was your sense of justice when innocent people were dragged through years of false accusations? Where was your sense of fairness when you smeared those who dared question you? When you called for the censorship of anyone who presented a different point of view? She shook her head. And now, after all the damage you have done, you still refuse to admit it. You insist that history will vindicate you. That despite the lies, despite the falsehoods, despite the deception, you were right. Her gaze hardened. History will remember you, Congressman Schiff, but not as a defender of democracy, not as a man of integrity. History will remember you as the politician who weaponized falsehoods, who divided a nation, and who betrayed the very principles he claimed to uphold. A murmur rippled through the room, not loud, but noticeable. Some lawmakers nodded ever so slightly. Others remained stoic, unwilling to take a side in a battle they had watched unfold for years. The cracks in Schiff's carefully constructed facade were beginning to show. Leavitt took a deep breath, allowing the weight of her words to settle before delivering the final truth. You have spent your career demanding accountability from everyone else. Today, that accountability is at your doorstep, and no amount of excuses, no amount of deflection, no amount of spin can change the simple reality. You lied to the American people, and now you are being held to the same standard you once imposed on others. The room was still. Schiff didn't respond. He couldn't. For the first time, the man who had spoken so often, so forcefully, so assuredly, had nothing to say. A heavy silence filled the chamber, thick with the weight of everything that had just been said. The walls of power, once a shield for Adam Schiff, now seemed to close in around him. He shifted in his seat, his expression carefully measured, but the slight tension in his jaw betrayed him. He knew he had to respond. He had to regain control of the moment before it slipped further from his grasp. With a slow inhale, Schiff finally leaned forward, his hands clasped together as he spoke. What we are witnessing here today is nothing more than a partisan attack, he said, his voice carrying the same practiced smoothness that had once commanded headlines and shaped narratives, a desperate attempt to rewrite history and vilify those who stood up for the truth. A few murmurs of approval came from his side of the aisle, but they were subdued, uncertain. Even his usual allies seemed hesitant, as if waiting to see whether he could hold his ground against the relentless assault of facts that had just been laid before him. Leavitt's lips curled slightly, almost as if she had expected this exact response. She didn't flinch. She didn't waver. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, giving Schiff the chance to finish his statement. But her silence was not one of surrender. It was one of certainty. When he paused, she stepped forward again. "Partisan attack?" she repeated, her tone laced with restrained incredulity. "Congressman Schiff, if you think facts are partisan, that tells us everything we need to know." The words landed like a hammer. A few heads turned toward Schiff, waiting for his rebuttal, but none came. Leavitt took a slow breath, keeping her gaze locked on him. "You stood before this body for years and assured the American people that you had seen the proof with your own eyes. You manipulated intelligence, cherry-picked evidence, and dismissed any voice that dared to question your narrative. And now that you've been exposed, your only defense is to claim victimhood? She shook her head, a hint of disappointment in her voice. If this was truly about truth, if you were genuinely acting in the best interest of the American people, you would be standing here today with that undeniable proof you once claimed to have. You would be defending yourself with hard evidence, not empty words, but you can't, because it doesn't exist. It never did. Schiff opened his mouth as if to interject, but Leavitt continued, cutting through whatever attempt he had at salvaging himself. You accuse me of rewriting history, but the only person guilty of that is the man who spent years feeding the American people blatant falsehoods. The man who promised bombshell revelations that never came. The man who told this nation to trust him because he had the facts, when in reality all he had was an agenda. A sharp murmur moved through the chamber, louder this time. Some of Schiff's colleagues, once staunch defenders, glanced down at their desks, unwilling to meet his eyes. The cracks were showing, and everyone could see them now. Leavitt took another step forward. You talk about standing up for democracy, but what you did was the complete opposite. You misled the public, weaponized your position, and worked tirelessly to undermine the very system you swore to protect. And now that the truth has caught up to you, you want to hide behind political theatre? You want to play the victim instead of owning up to the damage you've done. She let her words linger, let them sink in. The room was no longer just listening. They were absorbing the reality of what had been said. Some were uncomfortable, others quietly impressed, but all were paying attention. Schiff, however, had nothing left to say. His defense had crumbled before it could even take shape. His usual bravado, his confidence, his ability to spin any situation in his favor, it was all gone. He sat there, a man who had built a career on words, now rendered speechless by the undeniable truth. Leavitt straightened, her voice steady as she delivered her final remark. This was never about politics. This was about accountability. And no matter how many times you try to dodge it, no matter how many excuses you offer, no matter how much you try to shift blame, the facts will always remain. The gavel struck once. The chamber remained silent. Schiff looked down, unwilling to meet the eyes of those around him, and at that moment everyone knew. The takedown was complete. The gavel's echo faded, but the weight of Karoline Leavitt's words still loomed over the chamber. The tension was suffocating, a silent acknowledgement that something had just shifted, something irreversible. Schiff remained seated, his usual composure now a mask barely holding together. His allies, once quick to defend him, now avoided his gaze, their silence speaking volumes. Leavitt let the moment linger before taking a step back, surveying the room. The air was thick with the gravity of what had just unfolded. There was no shouting, no immediate rebuttal, just the heavy stillness of realization settling in. The narrative that Schiff had carefully constructed over years had just been torn apart, and there was no putting it back together. She exhaled slowly, then turned her attention to the rest of Congress. The American people have watched for years as politicians in this very chamber have misled them without consequence. They have seen careers built on falsehoods, reputations protected by deception, and power maintained through manipulation, and they are tired of it. Her voice grew sharper, firmer. This is not just about one man. This is about an entire system that has allowed individuals like Congressman Schiff to operate without accountability. A system that has prioritized narratives over facts, theatrics over truth, and self-preservation over the very principles this institution was founded on. A murmur rippled through the chamber, some in agreement, others in discomfort, but no one could deny that she was right. The truth had become secondary to political expediency, and this moment was proof of that. Schiff finally moved, adjusting his tie as if regaining some semblance of control. He cleared his throat as if preparing to speak, but before he could utter a word, Leavitt continued. You may sit here today, hoping that if you wait long enough, this will pass, that if you stay silent, if you refuse to acknowledge the reality of what has been laid before you, it will all eventually be forgotten. But let me assure you, it won't. She turned, now addressing not just Schiff but every lawmaker present. The American people are watching. They have been watching, and they will remember who stood for truth and who hid behind lies. They will remember who sought justice and who evaded it. They will remember who fought for them and who only fought for themselves. The room remained silent, absorbing every word. Some lawmakers nodded subtly, while others sat motionless, knowing that the landscape had just changed. There was no more hiding. Leavitt took one final breath, her voice steady but resolute. This moment is not about retribution, it is about restoration. Restoring faith in our government, restoring honesty in our leadership, and restoring accountability to those who have evaded it for far too long. If we do not hold ourselves to the highest standard, then we have no right to call ourselves representatives of the people. She stepped away from the podium, the finality of her words settling over the room. Schiff remained motionless, staring down at the desk in front of him, his silence a testament to the undeniable truth. The gavel struck once more. The session was adjourned, but as lawmakers rose from their seats, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again.